This is an interesting exercise, both by the time we're doing it in, and certainly the topic has suddenly become very relevant to what's going on at the moment. I've been involved in trying to raise issues about the things that should have been included in the budget, and some of those are really sort of picking up on issues around privatisation, which has become a much more public issue, particularly because of some of the problems we've had with aged care and some of the debates that we're having around childcare. So when we started this, it was not exactly on the political agenda, but certainly the issue of privatisation, I think, has moved onto the agenda. So this is my first attempt to chair something in my role as the patron of the Fabians. And this is also a project that I wanted to start. And one of the reasons I wanted to put this on the agenda, and I'd be interested in sort of comments from other speakers, was I was looking for an idea, an area that would actually engage what might be called the broader progressive viewpoints in the political system at the moment. Because a lot of the stuff that was coming up post the election was saying things like, oh, there's all these unfixable divides amongst the progressive side of politics. You've got all of these inner city latte drinkers versus the sort of hardline workers in the community that we tend to be losing out to other things, and they don't seem to have much in common. And I was trying to work through the idea of what would be a topic that I thought would actually bridge that. And I thought about privatisation, because it's one of those areas where you get a remarkably broad anger about some of the stuff that's going on in the privatisation area. So I thought it's something that trad Labour voters, I think, find deeply offensive, and certainly some of the more recent Labour voters certainly find offensive. And I thought it would be an interesting idea to find out what the views on privatisation were. So the Fabian Society agreed we'd put up a project. Now, for those of you that haven't sort of picked up on the details, we sent it out to the Fabian email list, which has ex-members, interested members, current members, lots of others, and has about, I think, 6,900 emails on it, and it went out and came back. We got 600 approximately responses. And as anybody who's had much to do with research, that is a very high proportion of responses for an unsolicited questionnaire, where I think the average is somewhere around 2% from what I've read in the literature. So we were around 10%, and we would have had more, except there were some technical issues with some of the questionnaires, and we got some in with only 1 or 2 responses or no responses, or people sending us angry letters because they couldn't get it to work. So I think we can say quite clearly that this went out much earlier this year, when this whole COVID stuff was really just starting, that there was a very strong response to a questionnaire which had 5 questions and some details of people's backgrounds on issues that related to privatisation. Now, I'm a researcher from way back. I've run my own research thing. I've taught research methods at university. I've worked as a consultant. I've done projects. I had a lot of experience in research. And it was interesting looking through the responses. Now, I don't know how many of you have actually seen copies of the report. I don't think too many have, but I think there's copies. Phil, are there copies around tonight? I mean, have you got some on the screen or not? We have a brief report that we put together.
Give me a second and I will share it onto the screen.
Yeah. We put it together, and as I say, it was a quite short questionnaire, and because of the structure of the questionnaire that we were using, it had a limited way of sort of framing the questions and asking for the answers. We could only get them to agree and disagree on particular things, so we actually ended up jamming things together and asked them a series of questions about things that were related to the whole privatisation area. And just briefly, we picked the topics of research and vaccines, local production, and various things on that, government funding for PPE essentials, public control of private hospitals in crisis, and stop privatising, nationalising essential government services. And we got an extraordinary response because usually, I mean, you often get a limited response. But what we got in this time was actually the results to those questions when you added together the approve strongly or just approve. 94%, 91%, 92% and 92% for those two added together, which meant that almost every action, every area that we attempted to prod into got very similar responses. And as you go through the questionnaire more thoroughly, you realise, and they came from a wide variety of backgrounds, from people's own experiences. We asked them questions about that from from things they knew about. And there were a whole range of different topics in the open-ended question that we put at the end, which showed that this was not sort of triggered by one particular area, but there was a general feeling about privatisation that it should not be, and a fairly unified voice on the fact that those things that you're seen as essential services should never be privatised. And that came from a lot of angles. So I think, with the best of goodwill, we can't claim that this is representative of the population at large. We can say we've got a suspicion it is actually fairly representative of what might be called a broad group of what might call themselves progressive people and be interested in the Fabian Society. And I know that doesn't spread widely, but I suspect that it spreads surprisingly widely in terms of the sort of interest areas that people expressed themselves, particularly when they ran through all of the stuff. It went to health, government services, all sorts of different things that people really objected to, selling things off, getting rid of things, transport. A lot of anger, obviously, about things that had once been part of the public service and those things that were once called public utilities, which I think only exist now in sort of board games. But that there were really varied but solid views that people felt uncomfortable with the concept, which I think was really encouraging for something that was put together and put out fairly quickly to a fairly dispersed audience. And the questionnaires came in quite quickly too. So I think, judging on the basis of having been a very long-term researcher, and I'm hoping Rebecca will actually confirm, because we've both been researching for a very long time, that level of quick response, diverse ages, sex, locations, and diverse interests on a particular topic is a sign that there is a strong interest in privatisation in all its forms and different areas. And yet, when I went through, I spent some time today, I mean, I've had a look before, trying to find more examples of research into privatisation, of questionnaires in particular. I wasn't looking through the focus group stuff, and I think Rebecca might know a bit more about that. But, that there's obviously a strong feeling that there's something going wrong. And if you look at some of the debates that are now happening around issues like aged care in particular, because the issue of the privatisation, particularly in Victoria, have become part of that, the issue of the availability of PPE and various other things, just indicate that there's a considerable unease about what's been happening about the selling off of what are seen as public services, the reduction of the availability of the community services being run by communities, the privatisation of childcare, which is one I've got particular interest in, which has sent the fees up far too high. I won't go into that because I know far too much about it and it'll end up being boring. Anyhow, so I thought as an intro, I'll give you that and give you my opinion that we can probably, without doing more research, that would be quite useful to get a few more examples that we can use for publicising it. We can say quite clearly that this is an area that does unite, I think, the progressive side of politics across the board, from the old working class through to the inner city dwellers and other groups that one wants to stereotype and use as a way of trying to put down the progressive side of politics. And the Fabians as an organisation that explores particular issues, promotes them, and hopefully convinces parties to do something about it, that are picking it up and possibly using our networks into, particularly the Labour Party. I mean, the Greens have been articulate about some forms of privatisation, but I went right through the whole platform of the federal ALP and found practically no mentions of it. And it's quite interesting that the speech that was made by Albo this week about childcare went through making a lot of comments about the funding of childcare, but failed to mention something like 80% of children's services places are now actually in the private sector. And one of the reasons it's become expensive and badly placed and various other things is that it is uncontrolled and focused towards making money for people who get into the area rather than meeting needs of children. So this is our first public airing of the survey, and I'm just hoping that this might be something that inspires the people that are here and other people that might pick it up to actually go up and try and put this on the agenda, because I think that it would actually get quite a strong response from voters who feel somehow or other distrust of what's going on in politics at the moment, because those in power don't seem to be concerned about them, or if they are concerned, it seems to be only in those economic areas of pay and money and jobs, but not in those areas of government services of the basis of democracy. So that's my introduction. If anybody has questions, stick them on the chat thing and we can try and answer them. And I'd like to throw the question to Rebecca Huntley, who has an enormous range of research, qualitative and quantitative, and see how she feels about what we know and what we don't know, and why don't we ask the questions? You know, why don't we use something? Because there's very little has been done in the last 3 to 4 years, as far as I can see. A lot of stuff came out in the 90s and into the first decade of surveys around this stuff, but since then it seems to have fallen off the agenda, and I'm not sure why. Any answers, Rebecca?
Lots of probing questions, but just, I suppose the first thing that...
Introduce yourself, yes.
I suppose the first thing I want to say is thanks so much for inviting me. It's always a wonderful thing to be involved with the Fabians and to be involved in anything with Eva as well. So I've got to validate what Eva's comments and also the feedback from the survey. Yes, it's not a kind of a properly weighted survey, but it's pretty representative of what the broader community feels about privatisation, which is that particularly for essential services, so anything to do with, you know, electricity or transport or health in particular, or any kind of human services, that that it's really somebody's getting paid, somebody's getting a return on investment, and it's not voters. So there is a sense that the public doesn't win out. It's one of the things that the government, it's a kind of a lazy option that the government takes. And there is quite a bit of scepticism about the idea about whether necessarily corporations may run services so-called more efficiently, but not necessarily more efficiently. They might run things more efficiently than the state, but that the people who are profiting the most are the private organisations that are doing this, particularly in public-private partnerships. That being said, so the challenge, I don't think, is convincing people that privatisation is not something that is really for the public good. The question is, what do you do once something has been privatised, or even once a service has been nibbled at the ends around kind of, semi-privatised? So there is a little bit of a fatalism about this when this happens, and I saw this particularly in different kinds of states when we think about things like electricity privatisation. And so interestingly, in places like South Australia, but also Queensland, New South Wales, when you ask people what you think is driving up the cost of utilities and electricity, they point to things like privatisation, and they see, for example, sometimes they point to the kind of slow pace of, for example, investment in renewables, about the fact that the system has been privatised and there's a natural kind of conservatism from private organisations to kind of do things like, you know, move towards more renewable energy, again, for the public good, and make that kind of investment. The difficulty here, like I said, and the larger challenge for the Fabians is to work out, you know, how do we not just stop further privatisation, but do, you know, to actually restore services in the way that they could be restored. So particularly in an area like childcare. That's a really, really difficult argument to mount at a time in which there is, you know, cynicism about politicians and anxiety around things like taxes, and how do you kind of sell that to the community, particularly in election times. So it is a really kind of tricky argument to make, but it's one that we have to really turn our minds to as soon as we possibly can, because one of the things that is concerning me is that we're beginning to have this view that the state should only really do creative or bold initiatives in terms of spending when there's a crisis. So this is kind of, you know, presentation of the state as a kind of somewhat uninterested, benevolent parent who occasionally we go to when things are really, really, really bad, you know, for a handout, and they might, you know, give us a little bit of money and off we go to try and get our lives back on track, and we don't see them. So there's, and we saw that a bit in the GFC, and we're particularly seeing it now, although, so I'm worried very much about this kind of idea that the state is really only there for crisis spending, and the rest of, and then for a very short period of time, and for the rest of the time should then, you know, be absolutely obsessed with things like, you know, the surplus and so forth. Of course, we've seen in the kind of recent response to COVID that even though there has been, you know, some significant public spending, and, you know, for a short period of time childcare was free, it was very, very quick reversal of that kind of you know, that kind of approach. And we didn't see, for example, in the recent budget, anything in the relation to, for example, some really obvious examples which could have been done in terms of things like spend on social housing, which has obviously been across the country something that could be a really good for the economy, good for society, something that will, you know, hang around for a while and be useful and effective for a while. So, so like I said, and to reinforce what Eva said, privatisation on the nose, but if not privatisation, what? And so what are the kinds of arguments, what are the kinds of examples that we need to put to voters and to citizens during election times, and not to really argue that this is actually something that the kind of privatisation base can be put back in its box to some extent, and that is, you know, that is the greatest challenge. I don't know what I do now. Don't know if there's questions. I've been just looking at the different things in the chat. I kind of ran out of stuff.
I was just going to say, you know, in your own research, have you actually come up with that? Because I think there's actually far less hostility to privatisation amongst voters than there is amongst politicians.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of the politicians think it's far too hard, so they don't even mention it in passing. Because when you actually talk to voters, voters are much more interested in the fact that you might unprivatise their bus routes, which have had the bus stops moved to further positions, you know, unprivatise the parking station that's now charging them a large amount to park near the hospital. I think there's a quite strong voter thing, depending how you frame it. And I think rather than seeing it as a problem of voters, I can see it as a problem of parties, because the response recently from somebody of the Labour Party, when there was some mention of possibly deprivatising the childcare services or unwinding, I think it might have been an aged care services, was it was too hard. And I don't think it is too hard. I think because a lot of the parties, and I think the ALP is guilty on this one too, have got themselves tangled with the tail end of neoliberalism, and they're looking always for an economic outcome. And for a lot of the voters, they just want something that gives them good services. And when they get sort of people prating at them about the economic outcomes, and the efficiency and the cutting of costs and saving government money, you know, the voter will generally glaze over and wonder what the hell you're talking about.
There's a very interesting comment from Ralph from Melbourne around the nexus between privatisation and corruption, which I wanted to address. So I think that there's a broader question here in relation to, you know, part of the argument that not only that privatisation should stop, but that we should be in the process of the state reclaiming control and direction of key human services and public services of importance to public good. So we have to, you know, continue to build, and, you know, by build from a very low base, people's trust that government is going to be a transparent, effective and trustworthy custodian of these services. So that's kind of the first thing, kind of, you know, continuing to do whatever we can to stop the declining levels of trust in government. And the second thing, of course, is that, you know, to this point, which are kind of, there's a link there from this kind of connection between privatisation and corruption. And of course, you know, the general public are always kind of cynical when any big money deals are done by government. Anything is, you know, whether it's a new road or, you know, they're selling off certain kinds of assets, whether, you know, how has the deal been made? You know, how transparent has that process been? You know, who's been around tickling from the top, so to speak. I've just been watching what ICAC today, and so there is kind of, you know, even if there is an actual proven corruption, and there's some kind of interesting insights there that have been shared by Ralph, but there's this perception that that you know, that kind of that nexus between politicians and their mates in the private sector, that somehow that plays a role in these processes. So that's and so, you know, looking at things like, part of what we have to look at too, that broader context around transparency around donations and to political parties. You know, obviously there's been more improvement at the state level, at the federal level with that, and perhaps the federal ICAC will be useful in that regard as well.
And I just cut in with one extra point that I didn't mention in the results, which I think feeds back into some of the points you're making. The people don't necessarily want a highly centralised government-run program, sort of top-down and bureaucratic. But there were signs in some of the open-ended questions, and there's also signs when you take a look at the political advocacy that's going on at the moment, that people want services to be run locally and run by the people that want to use them. And I think that that's where government should be going, or people looking for voters should be going, is to ensure that local government and community services that are local, you get it very much with the Indigenous stuff, but you're getting it with a lot of other groups as well, that we can have a system which is bottom-up, government funded and run and organised in a sense, rather than the top-down version that we had last time. And I think that's worth considering.
Absolutely.
We should probably switch in and bring Meredith into the program.
So look, thanks very much, Eva, and thanks also, Rebecca, for your comments. What I really wanted to, I suppose, do was talk a little bit about what we've done in Western Australia, where we have been campaigning really for about 9 or 10 years, running joint union campaigns, which have clearly, as part of the central objective, is to stop and reverse privatisation, as well as issues around improving funding for government services or stopping cuts. But that's a campaign originally called Save Our Services, now called The Public Good. We've been running it really for many years, as I said, about probably 9 or 10. It's funded by public sector unions. It's funded separately to their affiliation fees, and I think that's always given a significant buy-in to those unions. And we have a sort of steering group where the largest unions, work with us on strategy and direction. It's really always been an umbrella campaign where we have had a ability to, I suppose, consistently talk about privatisation, and for us, for most of that time, we're talking about the failings of it under a Barnett government, because that was, you know, a Liberal Barnett government. That's what we had in WA at the time. And pointing to examples, and there weren't the big examples like perhaps there were in some other states. There was lots of small creeping examples for a lot of that period before 2017. So small services being contracted out or privatised. And really a lot of what we did was talking about the problems with privatisation, highlighting those things as they occurred, and really trying to amplify campaigns that unions were running in various different parts of the public sector. And I think the campaign we ran was really a response to recognising that unions had been fighting this fight in their own patch for many years, often doing it in similar but different ways, often with sort of similar but different campaigns. And I think what that looked like to the public was something that was quite piecemeal, and perhaps every issue was treated separately and different. And what we were really trying to do, I think, is bring together all of those things as an ongoing narrative about this is, you know, this is what Liberals, you know, it is the Liberals mostly, not exclusively, but this is what Liberal governments do, and this is the impact it has on the community, and to try and talk about that in a consistent way with a consistent kind of campaign frame, so that then as individual unions kind of had to have those fights, whether they were in hospitals or whether they were in prisons, or ultimately we ended up with quite a big election issue around electricity. There was at least a kind of common narrative that sat across the top of that. I think the other thing that our campaign was really important for doing was keeping the conversation going. And I think one of the things in the union movement, we tend to kind of intersect with these issues often around elections. So we sort of see it as a threat with an election, or there's an announcement made and we respond to that. But it tends to be, it kind of lacks the longevity perhaps to be able to engage the public and start to cut through to demonstrate that, you know, this is not just a question about maybe one hospital here or a prison service there. This is an overall approach that's been taken that fundamentally isn't delivering for the community. And Rebecca, you've already really, I think, sort of touched on the things that we saw coming through our polling, and the things that what we find when you talk to the community rings absolutely true, that privatisation, it's not better. So ordinary people don't get better services out of it. In fact, often they're very frustrated about the lack of services. And once you start sort of talking to people about their experiences, either, you know, their own experiences maybe in the health system, or their relatives' experience trying to get the services they need because they're elderly or something else, people can relate to the kind of lack of access and the increased costs that are often, you know, part of what goes along with privatisation. So people have that individual experience. So it's not cheaper, which is, you know, often the great promise. And I think it's clear that it ends up costing everyone more in the long run. And again, lots of examples about where things have been privatised and then governments have had to put in corrective action to kind of fix things up, or there's been long-term kind of consequences. So those sort of points, that it's not, doesn't lead to better services for everyday people, and it ends up costing everyone more anyway. So what's the point? And, you know, I think absolutely people will get that, and their own experiences have kind of led them to that conclusion. So that campaigning, I think, has been really important. As I said, we've really been doing it consistently, and we've kind of changed the way we perhaps do it, and maybe we've tweaked some of the messages. But I think it's served us really well. And I think the best example was prior to the 2017 state election, where the Barnett government announced they wanted to privatise Western Power, the electricity utility here. I think there was fertile ground then for the very strong campaigns in opposition to that. So in addition to what we were already sort of doing, the two unions in that area, so the ASU and the ETU ran a massive campaign, lots of advertising, lots of engagement with their members, significant campaign around that particular importance of that particular public service to the community. Very effectively targeted sort of seats. Talked a lot about bushfires. There was it's not just about price; it's also about safety, and I think they prosecuted that argument very well. The Labor Party also recognised that it was an important issue, and so they, were obviously in the frame talking about how it should be resolved as well. So in the end, of course, we all claim the great success, was our own. But I think it's clear that, that election was won because you had a really strong and consistent message from the union movement over a long period of time about the pitfalls of privatisation. It was amplified by the union movement and the people that worked in that sector. It was amplified in a particular community that might have been more at risk, and clearly there was a solution in electoral terms in terms of there being a real difference between the two major parties on this point. I think it is really important to recognise that, we don't assume that Labor governments don't privatise, and we've already had to, since 2017, we've had to kind of campaign to protect some parts of the public sector from being privatised. Land gates and land registry office here quite significant, and the public sector union did a lot of work to, head that off and mitigate it, and they did achieve that, but without sort of a campaign that's kind of based in influencing the community, that sort of probably would have been subject to much more privatisation than the outcome now. It is also worth noting that this is a government that is bringing services back in-house. I think partly that's because they nailed their colours so clearly to the mast in the election that they were going to support privatisation. So it's kind of easier, I think, for that to be reversed now, but it's never easy. So I think it's, it's not as simple as just sort of expecting that will happen as contracts end. I think there's a lot of work that goes on in terms of making the argument about why those private providers aren't delivering, and making sure that there's political will to then end those contracts and bring them back in-house. So I think it's, even if it happens in small ways, it's to be, really congratulated and amplified, because I think it's like a muscle. The more governments do that, bring services back into the public hands, the easier it will be for it to happen in the future. So I think that's important, and maybe understanding that we might not be able to do, it might take us a longer time to get to those bigger public policy pieces. I think childcare is, really interesting, but I think we need to kind of get them exercising that ability to bring things back in-house to make that an easier road to hoe. I might just sort of leave it there and perhaps let questions kind of flush out anything else that people are particularly interested in.